There's this fantasy running wild on Wall Street right now. It's the idea that Nvidia, after one of the most incredible stock runs in history, is somehow going to do it all over again. That this absolute titan of a company is going to 10x from here. But is that even possible? Let's actually break it down and see what's really going on.
I mean, just read this quote. It really captures the sheer scale of the hype, doesn't it? It paints this picture where NVIDIA becomes so central, so fundamental to our future, that pretty much everything else, it's just a footnote. It's a really powerful idea, but is it actually grounded in reality?
And that really brings us to the core question of this whole thing. Let's just forget the hype for a second and look at the raw numbers. We are talking about a company that's already valued in the trillions. Can something that massive really, truly multiply its value by 10?
Okay, so to even try and figure out where NVIDIA is going, we first have to understand the incredible journey that got us here. The last few years, they weren't just good for NVIDIA, they were the result of this once-in-a-lifetime cocktail of events that is almost impossible to imagine happening again. Think about it. 4 massive forces all collided in a perfect storm. First, the AI hype ignited by ChatGPT basically turned GPUs into essential infrastructure overnight. Then you have NVIDIA's CUDA software, which created this incredibly powerful moat, locking developers in. At the same time, big tech went on a historic spending binge for those chips. And somehow, the supply chain performed a miracle and bent to meet that insane demand. It was like financial alchemy. It was amazing. And yeah, it was unrepeatable.
So, that was the incredible ascent. But you know the saying, what goes up must eventually feel the pull of gravity. The 10x dream is over, and it's because there are 4 powerful forces that are now pulling that rocket ship right back down to Earth.
Let's break these down one by one. First, we're going to hit the simple, brutal reality of math, what I'm calling the arithmetic wall. Then we'll look at a major risk that's hiding in plain sight, customer concentration. After that, the quiet rebellion happening from within, the in-house coup. And finally, the hard, cold limits of the real world itself, physical bottlenecks.
So let's start with that arithmetic wall. A 10x from today's valuation means NVIDIA would be worth this number, $40 trillion. Just let that number sink in for a second.
So what does $40 trillion even mean? Well, to put it into perspective, it would be 1/3 of the entire global stock market. Not just tech, not just the US market, literally everything. A single company worth more than every single company in Japan, the UK, Canada, Germany, and India combined. That's not just unlikely, it's structurally impossible.
All right, the second force of gravity, customer concentration. You'd think a multi-trillion-dollar company would have a huge, vast, diverse customer base, right? Well, you'd be wrong. In a recent quarter, just 2 customers, accounted for nearly 40% of NVIDIA's sales. That is less diverse than your average neighborhood pizza shop. It is a massive risk when your entire fate rests in the hands of so few. Now, if you bring up that risk, the bulls, they will often tell you this. They'll argue that those huge customers have no other choice because NVIDIA has no real competition. And you know what? For the absolute highest end, top-of-the-line chips, that has been kind of true. But that whole landscape is changing, and it's changing fast.
And this is exactly why. Those same massive customers are staging what you could call an in-house coup. They are not waiting around for anyone. Google has its TPUs, Amazon has Trainium, Meta's ramping up its own MTIA chips, and Microsoft is busy developing its own AI silicon. Look, they don't even have to beat NVIDIA for this to matter. They just have to exist. That creates alternatives, and that creates negotiating leverage.
The final forces, well, it's just physics. Even if demand was infinite and competition didn't exist at all, NVIDIA simply cannot grow faster than the real world will allow. The supply of crucial HBM memory is incredibly tight. The advanced packaging capacity from TSMC is a major bottleneck. And maybe most critically, data centers are slamming into the limits of the electrical grid. You can't just conjure gigawatts of power out of thin air.
Okay, so we've pretty thoroughly deconstructed the whole 10x fantasy. But that does not mean NVIDIA is doomed. Not at all, far from it actually. So if the moonshot is off the table, what does the realistic future actually look like for them? Let's be clear, NVIDIA's moat is incredibly strong, but its real defense isn't just one single GPU. No, it's the entire integrated stack. It's everything from the CUDA software that literally everyone is trained on to the networking and the full rack-scale systems. They haven't just built a product, they've built a platform, and platforms are incredibly sticky. So, given that strength, here are 3 plausible scenarios for the next 5 years. The base case, which is probably the most likely, sees the stock growing another 50 to 150%. A super optimistic bull case, where some new AI app creates another huge demand shock, that could see it double or triple. But notice, even in the absolute wildest bull case, we're talking 2-3x, not 10x. And of course, there's a bear case, where a spending pause could cause a pretty significant pullback.
So what's the big takeaway from all this for anyone watching this company? Well, it means the game has fundamentally changed. The way we think about NVIDIA has to evolve.
The company has graduated. It's no longer that scrappy growth rocket where you bet on these fantasy multiples. It is now a macro asset. It's a pillar of the global economy. And the investment thesis has to shift from betting on an exponential explosion to focusing on sustainable, world-class compounding.
So let's just state the conclusion as plainly as possible. Based on the math, the competition, and the physics, the 10x fantasy is dead. The opportunity for another tenfold explosion from this massive size, that ship has sailed. But that doesn't take anything away from what NVIDIA is, a dominant, wildly profitable compounding machine that will almost certainly continue to be one of the most important companies on the planet for years to come.
And that leaves us with one final question to think about. NVIDIA's entire identity and its massive valuation have been built on a story of exponential, world-changing growth. So, in a future where that narrative shifts to one of steady, powerful compounding, is that enough to satisfy a market that still secretly dreams of 10x? That right there is the new question for NVIDIA.